In 2013, the name Michael Danson still carried a kind of reverence in the marble halls of Atlanta's legal district. A tall, impeccably dressed defense attorney with a smooth voice and a gift for persuasion, he had spent over 2 decades protecting the rights of the accused, murderers, embezzlers, white-collar thieves. He knew the system, the loopholes, and, most importantly, the people who could be persuaded to look the other way. In the world of criminal law, Danson was a shark who smiled. But beneath the confidence, behind the expensive suits and the handshakes with judges, something darker was building, a kind of rot that fed on arrogance and greed. For years, Danson had been flirting with the edges of ethics. Minor infractions, quiet manipulations, late filings that conveniently disadvantaged prosecutors, judges who seemed to owe him favors. To outsiders, it looked like charisma. To those closer to him, it looked like corruption. His downfall began, ironically, with a case that should have cemented his legacy. In early 2014, Danson was defending a local businessman, Robert Klein, charged with laundering millions through shell companies. Klein was well-connected and desperate. If convicted, he faced decades behind bars. Danson saw the opportunity not just for a victory, but for leverage. The prosecution's case relied on a series of financial ledgers found in Klein's office, evidence that directly tied him to offshore accounts. But before trial, those ledgers mysteriously disappeared from police custody. When they resurfaced weeks later, entire pages were missing. The evidence had been tampered with, clearly and deliberately. The case began to collapse, and whispers of Danson's magic rippled through the courthouse. The businessman walked free. The media painted Danson as brilliant. Inside the prosecutor's office, however, something didn't sit right. A junior clerk tasked with archiving exhibits had noticed that the evidence box had been signed out by someone using credentials that didn't exist, an internal ID number 1 digit off from Danson's own assistant. That tiny inconsistency started a quiet inquiry that would grow into a full-scale federal investigation. For months, the FBI followed Danson's trail, his bank records, his case history, his communications. What they uncovered was staggering. Over a 10-year period, Danson had orchestrated a shadow network of bribes and evidence manipulation. Court clerks were paid to misplace files. Police officers were offered luxury vacations to forget chain of custody details. Witnesses were intimidated through intermediaries. It wasn't just occasional misconduct, it was systemic corruption. But Danson was clever. He never handled money directly. Payments were routed through fake legal research firms, run by shell companies that reported non-existent employees. Every transaction looked like a legitimate expense, until federal auditors started tracing connections between his firm's expenditures and the sudden lifestyle upgrades of courthouse staff. One night in August 2015, Danson's assistant, a young paralegal named Rachel Meyers, was pulled over for speeding outside the city. In her car, officers found an envelope containing $20,000 in cash and a list of case numbers. She panicked and told investigators everything. She described how Danson had coerced her into acting as an intermediary, how he'd used her name, her email, even her signature to disguise payments to key witnesses. She described his growing paranoia, his obsession with control, his belief that he was untouchable. That confession cracked the case wide open. When the FBI raided Danson's office 2 days later, he was mid-meeting, calmly dictating notes for an upcoming trial. Agents found shredded documents in the waste bin, encrypted USB drives hidden inside hollow law books, and coded messages in legal drafts. It was a cinematic unraveling of a man who had built his life on manipulating truth. During the trial that followed, prosecutors presented a mountain of evidence: bank statements showing illegal transfers, witness testimony from bribed officials, recordings of Danson discussing favors in exchange for leniency. The jury listened as his voice, captured in secret, detailed a cynical philosophy of law. Justice isn't about truth. It's about control. You control the facts, you control the verdict. The courtroom that once revered him became the stage of his ruin. His defense team, ironically composed of former protégés, tried to argue entrapment, claiming that Danson had been set up by jealous colleagues. But the evidence was too thorough, the pattern too obvious. In 2016, after a 6-week trial, Michael Danson was convicted of obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and conspiracy to commit fraud. He was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. The sentence made national headlines. Star defense attorney becomes the accused. Inside prison, Danson initially kept the same smug composure. He offered legal advice to inmates, filed appeals for cellmates, and even challenged his own conviction repeatedly. But with each denial, the arrogance eroded. The walls closed in, and the man who once dictated the pace of courtrooms now spent his days reading outdated legal textbooks in a gray cell. Former clients sued him. His law license was permanently revoked. His family, 2 grown sons and a wife of 20 years, moved away quietly, refusing interviews. The courthouse he once dominated refused to hang his portrait in its distinguished alumni gallery. His legacy was erased. Years later, a journalist managed to interview him inside the prison library. His tone was subdued, reflective, and strangely cold. When asked if he regretted his crimes, Danson didn't mention guilt or morality. He said only, "I regret trusting a system that rewards those who cheat quietly. I just got too loud." It was a chilling glimpse into a mind that never fully believed in right or wrong, only in winning or losing. Outside, the legal community struggled to repair its image. Several judges resigned after internal investigations linked them indirectly to Danson's activities. The Georgia Bar Association implemented new oversight policies requiring random audits of defense firms with unusually high acquittal rates. His downfall had triggered a quiet revolution in ethics enforcement. Yet for those who knew him personally, the story still lingered in uneasy silence. Many admitted that they'd suspected him for years but stayed quiet, because Danson won cases and winning was currency. By 2022, Danson's name had become shorthand for a different kind of corruption, the kind that hides behind degrees, charm, and eloquence. Law students whispered about him like a cautionary ghost. His old office building still bears faint marks of his name on a frosted glass door, half scraped away but still visible if you look closely. In the end, Michael Danson's story wasn't just about crime. It was about trust, the trust we place in those who claim to defend justice, and how easily that trust can be weaponized. The courtroom is supposed to be sacred ground, a place where truth is revealed through evidence and reason. But for nearly a decade, Danson turned it into his stage, rewriting truth for profit. His downfall reminds us that corruption doesn't always wear a badge or carry a gun. Sometimes it wears a tailored suit, speaks eloquently about integrity, and smiles as it signs away justice one case at a time. And when the curtain finally falls, the echo that remains isn't rage, it's disbelief. That a man who once fought for freedom could end up shackled by his own deceit. By 2018, Linda Mercer was a name that carried weight in Sacramento's family court circuit. Known for her empathy and sharp intellect, she had built a reputation defending women in abusive relationships and parents caught in bitter custody battles. Her voice had the calm, measured cadence of someone used to winning emotional wars through words alone. Colleagues described her as relentless in advocacy and surprisingly kind outside of court, a lawyer who truly seemed to believe in justice. But somewhere between her pro bono work and her high-profile cases, Linda began crossing invisible lines. It started small, billing hours she hadn't worked, padding client retainers. Her assistant said she often justified it as compensation for all the unpaid cases. Yet behind that justification was something deeper, a growing desperation to maintain a lifestyle her career could no longer sustain. She'd recently divorced, splitting her assets with a husband who'd grown tired of her 14-hour workdays. The settlement left her with mounting debt and a large suburban home she could barely afford. To her clients, Linda still appeared composed and successful. But her firm's accounts told a different story, one of hidden overdrafts, quiet panic, and late-night wire transfers between personal and professional accounts. The real unraveling began with the Harris case. Linda represented Melissa Harris, a mother fighting to regain custody of her 2 children after allegations of neglect. The case was messy. Accusations of substance abuse, conflicting witness testimony, emotional hearings. It was exactly the kind of battle that made Linda thrive. But Melissa was broke. She could barely afford gas to attend court, much less legal fees. So Linda did something that seemed generous at the time. She offered to take the case for free, on the condition that Melissa sign a future compensation agreement. The document stated that if Melissa ever came into money, through inheritance, settlement, or any other means, she would owe Linda 20% of it. Melissa signed it, grateful and unaware of the legal ambiguity. Months later, the children were returned to Melissa. It was Linda's proudest victory in years. Then, weeks after the ruling, Melissa's estranged father passed away, leaving her a modest inheritance of $75,000. When Linda found out, she called her client, not to congratulate her, but to collect. Melissa hesitated. She said she'd pay later, that she needed to get her life stable first. Linda pressed harder, sending formal letters, then threats of legal action. Within months, Linda sued her former client for breach of contract. The media caught wind of the story. Family lawyer sues domestic abuse survivor for payment. Public backlash was instant. Critics called it predatory. The State Bar began a quiet review of her conduct, and that's when investigators discovered something far worse. While auditing her firm's accounts, they found that Linda had been using client trust funds, money meant to be held securely for settlements, to pay her personal mortgage and credit card bills. Nearly $230,000 had vanished over 2 years, siphoned through transfers disguised as administrative reimbursements. She had doctored ledgers, deleted transaction emails, and forged signatures to keep her assistants from noticing. The State Bar escalated the case to the district attorney. What began as an ethical complaint turned into a full-blown criminal investigation for embezzlement and fraud. When detectives confronted her, Linda initially denied everything. She called the investigation political, claiming jealous rivals were trying to destroy her reputation. But evidence doesn't care about reputation. Forensic accountants traced every transaction, each withdrawal matching the dates of her personal loan payments and luxury purchases. By 2020, Linda Mercer was formally charged with 12 counts of wire fraud, misappropriation of client funds, and falsification of financial documents. The shock rippled through Sacramento's legal community. Judges who'd once praised her refused to comment. Former clients demanded refunds. Her office shut down overnight. During her trial, the prosecution painted her as a manipulator who weaponized compassion to gain trust. They described how she'd built her career on helping vulnerable people, only to exploit their vulnerability for money. One witness, a single mother named Diana Lopez, testified that Linda had promised to secure her a housing settlement, then disappeared after collecting an upfront fee. "She said she understood my pain," Diana told the court, her voice trembling. "But she just took my money and stopped answering calls." When Linda finally took the stand, she broke down. Between tears, she described her divorce, her sleepless nights, her crumbling finances. "I was drowning," she said. "I didn't set out to steal. I just thought I could fix it before anyone noticed." Her words drew sympathy from some, but the jury saw a pattern: intent, not desperation. Over several weeks, prosecutors presented 300 pages of bank statements, proving premeditation in every transaction. In 2021, Linda Mercer was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison. The judge, a former colleague, delivered the verdict with a visible heaviness. "You were trusted by people at their lowest," he said, "and you turned their faith into fuel for your own downfall." When she was led away, reporters noted how her once perfect posture had slumped, her expression hollow. The same courtroom she'd once dominated now echoed with the sound of her chains. Her home was foreclosed. The law firm's name was removed from the building directory. Her clients were reimbursed through a state victims' compensation fund, but the damage lingered. Dozens of families were left without closure, their cases delayed or derailed. The legal community branded her story a moral scar, an example taught in ethics seminars about how integrity erodes slowly, not suddenly. In prison, Linda tried to rebuild her sense of purpose. She joined an inmate education program, teaching basic legal literacy to other prisoners. Ironically, many of them admired her for her intelligence and ability to navigate the system. One inmate later said, "She knew everything about the law, but what she didn't know was how to forgive herself." When a journalist interviewed her 2 years later, she spoke quietly, staring at her hands. "People think corruption happens all at once," she said, "but it's 1,000 small choices. Every time you say, 'just this once,' you walk one step closer to the line. And one day you don't even see it anymore." Her words echoed beyond the prison walls, a confession not just of guilt, but of understanding. The irony of Linda Mercer's story is that she spent her life fighting for victims, only to become one of her own making. Her fall wasn't spectacular. It was slow, suffocating, and deeply human. A story of someone who wanted to save people until she forgot how to save herself. Jonathan Hale had the kind of reputation most lawyers dream about. In the polished corridors of downtown Chicago's federal courts, His name carried both admiration and envy. He was brilliant, eloquent, and ruthless, a prosecutor who never lost a case. Reporters loved him, judges respected him, and juries? They believed him without question. Hale had built a career on conviction rates that seemed superhuman, earning him the nickname the Closer. By 2015, he was the star of the U.S. Attorney's Office, handling some of the city's most high-profile corruption cases. When a politician or police officer was accused of bribery or misconduct, it was Jonathan who stepped up to bring them down. His cross-examinations were legendary, precise, devastating, theatrical. But power, even righteous power, has gravity, and for Jonathan Hale, that gravity began to pull inward. Behind his flawless record was an obsession, not with justice, but with winning. He began to view trials like performances, where the truth was less important than the outcome. Witnesses who hesitated were unreliable. Evidence that didn't fit the narrative was irrelevant. He justified it all as strategy. After all, he was putting away criminals. The city was safer. Who would question a hero? The first cracks appeared in 2016 during a case against a small-time alderman accused of taking kickbacks. Hale's team presented damning evidence, emails, bank statements, wire transfers. The jury took less than 2 hours to convict. But 6 months later, a Freedom of Information Act request from a local journalist revealed something odd. Certain exculpatory documents, files that could have weakened the government's case, had been withheld from the defense. When confronted, Hale dismissed it as a clerical error. The explanation was accepted. But internally, the Justice Department began keeping a closer eye on him. The second crack came when a former paralegal who'd worked under Hale for years resigned and filed a confidential ethics complaint. She claimed Hale often pressured staff to withhold evidence he deemed distracting or confusing for juries. He'd refer to it as cleaning the table. Still, the department hesitated to act. He was too valuable, too visible. Then came the case that destroyed him. In 2018, Hale prosecuted State v. Terrence Clay, a young man accused of shooting a police officer during a botched robbery. Public outrage was intense. The city wanted blood, and Jonathan Hale was the man to deliver it. The evidence looked airtight: gunshot residue, eyewitnesses, and a partial fingerprint on the weapon. The trial was brutal. The victim's family sat in the front row every day, clutching photographs. Hale spoke with righteous fury, painting Clay as a remorseless killer. When the jury returned a guilty verdict, applause broke out in the gallery. The judge sentenced Clay to life without parole. The city praised Hale as a hero. Another conviction, another victory. But a year later, new technology changed everything. An independent review of old forensic cases, part of a broader innocence project, retested evidence from Clay's trial using updated fingerprint analysis. The results showed that the print on the gun didn't belong to Clay. It belonged to another suspect, someone Hale's office had quietly ruled out early in the investigation. Worse, internal memos revealed that Hale had seen that analysis before the trial. He had known, and he had buried it. When the story broke, the fallout was immediate. Clay's conviction was overturned. He walked out of prison after 2 years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. Hale was suspended, then charged with evidence suppression, obstruction of justice, and perjury. During his trial, the same courtrooms that once echoed with his commanding voice now held it in judgment. Former colleagues testified against him. They described a man consumed by pride, someone who believed he was the only one smart enough to define justice. The prosecution presented emails where Hale explicitly instructed staff to omit the irrelevant analysis from discovery. His justification was chillingly pragmatic. If we don't convict him, the public will lose faith in the system. Sometimes you have to protect justice from itself. When the jury heard that line, the courtroom fell silent. In 2020, Jonathan Hale was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. His license was revoked, his awards stripped, his legacy erased. In interviews after the sentencing, jurors said what haunted them most wasn't the crime. It was the calmness with which Hale defended his actions. He truly believed he had done the right thing. Prison life was cruelly ironic for him. The man who had sent hundreds of others behind bars now lived among them. Some recognized him. A few even tried to attack him. He was moved twice for his safety. Those who knew him said the arrogance faded quickly. He spent most of his time in the library, writing legal appeals for other inmates. One prison official said he'd become obsessed with repentance. though not in the way most meant it. He wanted to rewrite his own story, to find some philosophical framework that could justify what he'd done. When a journalist asked him years later whether he regretted his decisions, Hale paused before answering. "Regret?" he said. "No, regret implies I did something for selfish reasons. I didn't. I did it for the illusion of order. The truth is, people don't want justice. They want resolution. I gave them that." Outside, Terrence Clay's story became a national headline about wrongful convictions and prosecutorial misconduct. His lawsuit against the city cost millions. Activists used Hale's case to demand reforms in how prosecutors handle evidence. The Justice Department implemented stricter oversight, requiring independent review panels for major cases. But even with those reforms, the shadow of Hale's career lingers in Chicago's courtrooms. Lawyers still whisper his name as a warning, a reminder of how conviction without conscience can destroy both the innocent and the enforcer. And somewhere in a quiet federal prison, Jonathan Hale continues to read court transcripts under the dim library light, still searching for a way to prove to himself that what he did wasn't evil, that it was necessary. But the truth, unburied at last, doesn't care about intention. It just waits, patiently, until even the most powerful are forced to stand before it. Stripped of their robes, their authority, and their certainty, Aaron Kingsley was the kind of lawyer who could sell sincerity in any courtroom. A calm, magnetic presence with pale eyes and a disarming smile, he made juries believe in second chances. His clients, often small business owners or struggling families, trusted him because he seemed human, not hardened. He'd clasp their hands, look them in the eye, and say things like, "We'll get through this together." For over a decade, that authenticity made him one of Boston's most beloved defense attorneys. But there was a different Aaron, one that his clients, his colleagues, and even his wife didn't know. A man whose charm wasn't just a tool of persuasion, it was camouflage. His secret life began quietly in 2014, when he started gambling at a private poker club frequented by judges and local businessmen. What started as weekend entertainment quickly grew into obsession. Within 2 years, Aaron was gambling 4 nights a week, borrowing against his savings, then against his firm's accounts. Each loss brought a new lie. When the firm's accountant began questioning missing funds, Aaron blamed clerical errors. When his wife found casino receipts in his jacket, he told her he was networking with clients. The mask never cracked. But debts have a way of exposing truth. By late 2016, he owed nearly $200,000 to a mix of legal lenders and illegal bookmakers. Under pressure, he made a decision that would destroy everything. One of his clients, a restaurant owner named Min Tran, was fighting tax fraud charges. Min had scraped together $80,000 as part of a restitution payment, money Aaron was supposed to transfer directly to the state. But instead of wiring it, Aaron quietly redirected the funds into a new account under a fake business name, promising himself he'd pay it back after the next win. He didn't. The casino took the money. Min's payment was never recorded. Weeks later, when the court reported a default, Min was furious. Aaron blamed bureaucracy, claiming the state lost the transfer. He even showed Min a forged email confirmation as proof. It was convincing enough to buy him time, but not much. When the state threatened to revoke Min's bail, Aaron panicked. He mortgaged his home, paid a portion back, and prayed it would cover the trail. But the lie had already caught wind. A court clerk noticed irregularities between the receipt numbers Aaron submitted and the official database entries. The state treasury flagged the transaction for review. Soon after, investigators traced the payment to the shell company Harbor Solutions LLC, a name registered under Aaron's brother-in-law, but created from Aaron's office computer. Within weeks, the Massachusetts Bar Association launched an internal inquiry. What they found expanded far beyond a single missing payment. Over 3 years, Aaron had misappropriated more than $600,000 in client funds, settlements, restitution checks, escrow accounts, all funneled through the same network of fabricated entities. Each transfer was disguised as a holding transaction or pending disbursement. He had even gone so far as to invent fake case numbers to justify them. The evidence was overwhelming, but when confronted, Aaron's first reaction wasn't fear, it was relief. Colleagues recalled how, during his disciplinary hearing, he seemed almost calm, as if he'd grown tired of maintaining the façade. He admitted everything. "I kept thinking I could balance it out," he told investigators. "Just one more case, one more win, and I could fix it." But I forgot what it felt like to stop lying. Still, remorse didn't undo the damage. Dozens of clients were left bankrupt. One woman lost her home when her settlement check never arrived. Another, a father injured in a factory accident, had his medical bills sent to collections because the trust account Aaron was managing had been drained. The criminal charges were inevitable: wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. The media swarmed the courthouse on the day of his arraignment, broadcasting images of the once-admired attorney being led in handcuffs down the same marble steps he used to climb with confidence. In 2019, Aaron Kingsley was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read the verdict. His wife, sitting behind the defense table, wept quietly. He didn't look back at her. At sentencing, the judge spoke directly to him. "You spent your career defending people who made bad choices. And in the end, you became one of them. The difference is, you knew the system, and you used that knowledge to steal trust, not just money." In prison, Aaron's charm found little use. He spent his first months in isolation, targeted by inmates who recognized him from old trials. Eventually, he was transferred to a low-security facility where he worked as a library clerk. Those who met him there said he was polite but detached, as though living in a constant state of quiet penance. One inmate remembered asking him what it felt like to go from lawyer to prisoner. Aaron reportedly smiled faintly and said, "It feels like arguing a case you already lost." Outside, his story became a cautionary tale for every young attorney entering the field. The Massachusetts bar required new lawyers to attend an ethics seminar featuring his case as the centerpiece. His old firm rebranded completely, removing every trace of his name from the building. His wife filed for divorce a year into his sentence. The home they shared was sold to cover restitution. His teenage daughter reportedly refused to visit him, saying he used to say he fought for truth. But truth was just another bet he lost. Years later, a journalist wrote a retrospective piece on Aaron's fall, calling him the gambler who bet against justice. In a rare letter from prison, he responded, "I didn't bet against justice. I bet on myself, and the house always wins." That single line captured the essence of his tragedy. A man who believed he could outsmart his own conscience, who thought skill and intellect could rewrite morality. Today, his name is still whispered in Massachusetts law circles, not with anger, but with disbelief. Because Aaron Kingsley wasn't cruel or predatory. He was ordinary, a man who mistook brilliance for immunity, who let desperation rot the virtues that once defined him. His story is a quiet reminder that in the pursuit of power, the first casualty is always honesty. And by the time you realize it's gone, the person you were fighting for, the version of yourself that still believed in right and wrong, has already disappeared. Margaret Elwood had built her life on appearances. In the affluent circles of Denver's legal community, she was known as the Iron Lady of Civil Law, a nickname earned through decades of polished victories and merciless depositions. She ran her firm like a military operation, punctual, pristine, and profitable. Everything about her image, her tailored gray suits, her marble-walled office, the Mercedes she parked precisely between the painted lines, spoke of control. But beneath that perfect veneer was a woman coming undone. Her empire began showing cracks in 2017, when the Colorado bar began receiving quiet complaints about billing irregularities. Clients claimed Margaret's invoices included unexplained administrative fees that sometimes doubled the agreed rates. One client said she'd been charged for 36 hours of work in a single day. At first, the complaints were dismissed as misunderstandings, clerical errors, overworked staff. But there was a pattern, and that pattern was growing harder to ignore. The truth was that Margaret had been cooking her books for nearly 5 years. Her firm had expanded too quickly. Lavish office renovations, corporate retreats, and inflated salaries kept bleeding the accounts. Instead of scaling back, she raised fees and invented charges. She told herself it was temporary, until the next big case. But that next case never came. Then came the McAllister estate. It was supposed to be her redemption, a multi-million-dollar probate case involving 3 siblings and a contested will. Margaret represented the eldest, William, a mild-mannered architect desperate to keep the family estate intact. The other siblings wanted to liquidate everything. The dispute dragged on for months, and Margaret, ever strategic, convinced William to let her temporarily manage the estate's financial assets to prevent mishandling. He agreed. She set up a trust account, had him sign the authorization, and within days she began quietly moving funds. Some of the transfers went to legitimate expenses, appraisals, legal filings, but most of it flowed to her personal accounts. Vacations to the Caribbean, new jewelry, a down payment on a condo for her son. To keep the illusion intact, she forged quarterly reports showing steady balances. It might have worked if William hadn't died unexpectedly in a car accident 3 months later. After his death, his siblings demanded a full accounting of the estate. Margaret stalled, citing document delays. But when the court appointed an independent administrator, the truth surfaced like a corpse in shallow water. Nearly $1.8 million was missing from the trust. The administrator traced every withdrawal back to accounts linked to Margaret's firm. She denied it at first, claimed she'd invested the money for safekeeping. But the paper trail told a different story, one of greed hidden behind sophistication. Bank records showed transfers labeled as business development, partner dividends, and most damning of all, staff incentives. The so-called incentives were casino deposits and wire transfers to luxury retailers. The discovery shattered Denver's legal world. Margaret wasn't just a lawyer. She was a symbol of professional integrity. For decades, she'd lectured young attorneys on ethics, chaired bar committees, and publicly condemned financial misconduct. Now she was the face of it. When federal agents arrived at her office in February 2019, she was still sitting behind her desk, reviewing documents with a glass of Chardonnay at her elbow. She didn't resist. Didn't even look surprised. One agent later said, "It was like she'd been waiting for us." The trial that followed was methodical and merciless. Former clients testified one after another, describing how they'd trusted her completely. Her own accountant broke down under questioning, admitting that Margaret had ordered him to adjust ledgers and realign timesheets. He said she threatened to ruin his career if he spoke out. The prosecution painted her as a narcissist, a woman who believed she was too important to fail. Her defense team argued stress, overwork, and mental exhaustion. But when prosecutors played an intercepted phone call of her bragging to a colleague that no one ever checks a lawyer's math, the courtroom gasped. It took the jury less than 3 hours to reach a verdict. In 2020, Margaret Elwood was convicted of wire fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice. She was sentenced to 16 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $1.8 million in restitution. As she stood to be taken into custody, she glanced at the courtroom gallery. Her son, the same one she'd bought the condo for, stared straight ahead without emotion. Her colleagues looked away. For the first time in her life, Margaret had no control. In prison, the Iron Lady melted. Her reputation meant nothing inside those walls. The authority she'd wielded with a signature was replaced by routines dictated by others. Wake-up calls, inspections, cafeteria meals. She avoided conversation, rarely left her cell except to read in the corner of the common room. Inmates said she walked like someone still pretending to be in charge. A year into her sentence, a Denver journalist managed to secure a brief interview with her for a feature on white-collar crime. Her demeanor was as polished as ever, but her eyes seemed distant. When asked what she regretted most, she smiled faintly and said, "I stopped seeing people. They became files, numbers, liabilities. And when people become numbers, ethics become arithmetic." Her quote became infamous in legal ethics courses across the state, a chilling encapsulation of moral decay disguised as professionalism. Outside, the fallout from her crimes rippled for years. The McAllister estate was finally settled, though most of the money was unrecoverable. Her former firm dissolved, its partners scattered to other practices, their reputations tainted by association. The Colorado Bar Association overhauled its financial audit protocols, creating new rules for managing client funds, rules named informally the Elwood Safeguards. Her story became both a scandal and a warning. Students studying law whispered about her downfall, not with mockery, but with dread. Because Margaret's sin wasn't one of passion or desperation. It was precision, calculated, deliberate, and wrapped in the language of professionalism. By the time she reached her 5th year behind bars, few remembered her as a person. She was a case study, a headline, a cautionary tale. But in the rare moments when she spoke to fellow inmates, she still introduced herself the same way. "I'm Margaret. I used to be a lawyer." And maybe that's the cruelest irony of all. That the woman who once stood for justice spent her last years defining herself by what she used to be, not by what she became. Because in the end, it wasn't greed that destroyed Margaret Elwood. It was the belief that she was untouchable. And that belief, like all illusions of power, shattered the moment the gavel fell. Thomas Reddington was the kind of lawyer who made juries lean forward. Smooth, articulate, and unflinchingly confident, he had that rare gift of making lies sound like inconvenient truths. He didn't just argue cases, he performed them. His voice carried the weight of conviction, and his charm filled every corner of the courtroom. By 42, he was one of the most successful defense attorneys in Boston, representing politicians, businessmen, and high-profile clients accused of white-collar crimes. But success has its own gravity. It pulls harder than ambition ever could. And for Thomas, the line between defense and deceit began to blur so gradually that he didn't even notice it fading. It started innocently. A client accused of insider trading offered him a bonus after a successful acquittal, $50,000 in cash. Thomas hesitated for a few seconds, then accepted. After all, it wasn't technically illegal, but it changed something in him. It planted a quiet seed of greed that grew, case by case, into something far darker. By 2016, Reddington was living like a man twice his income bracket, private clubs, imported wines, and a townhouse overlooking the Charles River. His reputation for miraculous defenses drew in wealthier and more desperate clients, many of whom had far more to lose than a guilty verdict. He started promising results he couldn't guarantee, whispering to clients that he had connections in the courthouse, that outcomes could be influenced. Some paid extra for that kind of assurance, and Thomas made sure their money disappeared before they realized what he really meant. The first real cracks appeared during the Michael Trent case, a pharmaceutical executive accused of falsifying drug trials. The evidence was overwhelming and everyone expected a conviction. But somehow key documents went missing from the prosecution's files, and a juror was discovered to have received an anonymous message threatening her family. The case ended in a mistrial. Rumors began swirling almost immediately. The DA's office suspected witness tampering, but nothing could be proven. Still, Reddington's name started surfacing in whispers, even among his colleagues. He shrugged it off, blaming jealous rivals. But behind the scenes, the FBI had already started watching him. The real downfall came 2 years later. In 2018, Thomas took on a new client, Elias Romero, a real estate developer accused of laundering millions through shell companies. Romero was nervous, erratic, but he trusted Thomas. During one meeting, he hinted that he could pay for a guaranteed verdict. Thomas didn't refuse. Instead, he said, guarantees are expensive. Over the next month, Romero paid him nearly $400,000 through layered transfers, money that Thomas used to cover his debts, pay for renovations, and keep up his image. He promised Romero that he had arranged everything. But what Thomas didn't know was that Romero wasn't just a client. He was an informant. The FBI had turned him weeks earlier in exchange for leniency. Every meeting, every payment, every word was recorded. When Thomas handed Romero a forged court memo, supposedly showing that a judge had been bribed, the Bureau finally had what they needed. He was arrested outside the Suffolk County Courthouse on a gray Thursday morning, still wearing his tailored navy suit. The news spread faster than wildfire. By the time evening fell, every legal publication in Massachusetts had his photo on their homepage. Top defense attorney charged with bribery and obstruction. During interrogation, Thomas tried to spin it, insisting he was testing his client's honesty. But the audio recordings destroyed any illusion of control. He could be heard promising outcomes, arranged at the highest levels, laughing about how the system bends for those who can afford it. When the trial began, the courtroom was filled with faces he once impressed, prosecutors he'd outmaneuvered, judges he'd flattered, journalists who once called him brilliant. Now they watched with a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief as his double life unfolded in evidence. Bank statements showed secret transfers to offshore accounts. Emails revealed his manipulation of clients into paying for influence. One of his former paralegals testified that he'd ordered her to destroy sensitive documents after the Trent mistrial. The defense tried to portray him as a victim of his own success, a man who'd lost his way under pressure. But the jury didn't see pressure. They saw arrogance. He was convicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and attempted bribery of a public official. In 2020, Thomas Reddington was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who'd spent his career manipulating the justice system now stood powerless beneath its weight. His name was struck from the Massachusetts bar, his firm dissolved, and his assets seized. The townhouse was sold at auction. His wife filed for divorce a month after sentencing. Inside prison, Thomas struggled to adjust. He wasn't feared or respected, just another inmate in a gray jumpsuit, trading courtroom confidence for silence in the mess hall. Guards said he spent hours writing in notebooks, drafting imaginary appeals for cases he'd never file. He became obsessed with studying the same system he once exploited, as if understanding it could somehow undo what he'd done. A journalist who interviewed him years later described him as a man haunted by his own vocabulary. When asked if he believed justice had been served, Thomas replied, "Justice is a mirror. I spent my life tilting it toward others so I wouldn't see myself." The statement went viral, quoted in documentaries and podcasts exploring corruption in the legal world. It summed up his entire downfall, not as a story of greed but of self-deception. In Boston's courts, his name became a cautionary tale whispered among young defense lawyers. Don't go full Reddington. It meant, don't start believing you can bend the system forever. Years after his conviction, the courthouse steps where he'd once stood, giving confident interviews, still bore the faint memory of his arrogance. People who remembered him said he always smiled when cameras pointed his way, as if the spotlight could hide the truth. But the spotlight only made it clearer, because in the end, Thomas Reddington's greatest courtroom performance wasn't one that won him a verdict, it was the one that fooled himself. Henry Caldwell was the sort of lawyer who built empires out of loopholes. He specialized in corporate restructuring, complex, high-stakes work that required both intellect and nerve. For years, his clients called him the cleaner, a man who could untangle any financial mess and somehow make everyone look innocent in the process. His reputation was unmatched in Chicago's financial law circles. His clients included oil companies, banks, and even city contractors under federal review. Henry knew where every dollar hid, how every audit could be delayed, and which judge to request for a favorable hearing. His talent wasn't in arguing law, it was in bending it until it fit his client's shape. But even the cleverest men eventually find the edge of their own brilliance. Henry's downfall began with something deceptively simple: a favor for a friend. In 2018, an old college acquaintance named Andrew Pike approached him. Pike owned a construction company that had landed a lucrative city contract to renovate several municipal buildings. But there was a problem. The federal auditors were coming, and Pike's financials were riddled with unreported cash transactions and inflated expenses. If discovered, it could mean years in prison. Henry told him not to worry. "I'll handle it," he said. "You'll come out clean." He began by creating false invoices, shell company receipts for consulting services and equipment rentals. To anyone looking closely, they were vague, but to the auditors, they looked legitimate enough to balance the books. Henry then wired money between the shell accounts to create the illusion of payment flows, all while taking a quiet cut for his advisory services. It was supposed to be a short-term patch, enough to buy Pike time. But when the scheme worked flawlessly, Henry realized something. He could do this for anyone. And so he did. Over the next 2 years, he began secretly offering compliance services to several high-paying clients who wanted to hide losses, launder money, or bury tax liabilities. He was careful, too careful. Every fake invoice went through multiple offshore entities, every payment masked behind consulting contracts that looked genuine on paper. For a while, it seemed foolproof. His clients were thrilled, his income tripled, and his confidence became almost predatory. In conversations, he joked about editing reality. To him, law was no longer a system. It was a language he could rewrite at will. But then came a file that didn't belong to him. One morning in 2020, Henry's assistant mistakenly forwarded a confidential client email to a junior analyst at the Department of Revenue. The file included correspondence about adjusted tax pathways and attached invoices with company names that didn't exist. Within days, a federal audit began. Not just on his client, but on every entity tied to Caldwell and Associates. When investigators arrived at his office, Henry tried to maintain composure. He welcomed them, offered coffee, and confidently said, "You'll find everything in order." But as they began cross-checking his invoices, small inconsistencies appeared. Signatures that didn't match, payment dates overlapping across accounts, vendors who'd never been registered with the state. The first lie cracked under inspection, and from there, the entire network collapsed. By summer, the Department of Justice had traced over $2 million in fraudulent transactions across 10 companies, all facilitated through entities Henry had created. Some of that money went directly into his own accounts. When agents raided his office, they found handwritten notes outlining invoice choreography and audit defense logic. The arrest made national headlines. Top corporate lawyer charged with massive financial fraud. At trial, Henry was unflappable. He arrived in crisp suits, smiling politely at the cameras. His defense was intricate. He claimed he'd merely optimized his client's tax reporting structures. But prosecutors presented a simple truth. The optimization was fiction. A forensic accountant testified that Henry's so-called consulting firms were nothing more than P.O. boxes and inactive websites. The invoices, she said, were works of fiction more elaborate than the crimes they concealed. The courtroom atmosphere was tense. Each day, Henry listened as his empire disintegrated piece by piece, partners distancing themselves, clients turning state's evidence, even his former assistant testifying that he'd once told her, "Law is a weapon. You just need to know how to aim it." When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, Henry didn't flinch. Only when the judge sentenced him to 22 years in federal prison did his composure finally break. Witnesses said he stood frozen for nearly a full minute before the bailiffs led him away. In prison, the man once nicknamed the Cleaner found no mess he could fix. His intelligence, once admired, became a burden. He filed appeals, drafted motions for other inmates, and taught legal workshops in exchange for cigarettes and favors. But despite his efforts, he couldn't escape his own conviction. Every motion he filed ended with the same stamped response: denied. A documentary released years later featured interviews with some of his former clients. One said, "Henry didn't steal money. He stole trust. He made us believe we could get away with it because he believed he could too." It was the most fitting epitaph for a man who mistook manipulation for mastery. By 2025, Henry Caldwell's name had become a ghost in Chicago's corporate world. Firms quietly removed his case studies, universities deleted his guest lectures, and the state bar listed his disbarment in small text among dozens of others. No memorial, no sympathy, just a reminder that intellect without integrity eventually devours itself. And somewhere in a quiet prison cell, Henry still writes notes in the margins of law books, correcting the text as if the system might someday admit it was wrong. But the truth is simple. The system didn't fail him. He failed himself. Rachel Meyers had the kind of face juries trusted. Soft-spoken, deliberate, always wearing understated suits in shades of gray or navy, she radiated competence and calm. For nearly a decade, she served as an assistant district attorney in Phoenix, known for her poise under pressure and her uncanny ability to make witnesses feel safe. Colleagues said she was the conscience of the courtroom. She believed in justice, or at least, she made everyone believe she did. But behind her quiet brilliance, Rachel was drowning. By 2019, she was 41, divorced, and burdened with mounting debt. Student loans that had ballooned, credit cards she used to cover legal conferences and appearances she couldn't afford. Her salary as a public prosecutor barely covered the basics. But it wasn't just money that haunted her. It was the emptiness. After years of fighting to put criminals behind bars, she'd begun to feel disillusioned, like the scales of justice had stopped balancing long ago. The breaking point came during a high-profile narcotics case. The defendant, a mid-level dealer named Luis Ortega, was part of a cartel-linked ring operating in Arizona. His conviction would have been another badge on Rachel's resume, another win for the DA's office. But during pre-trial discovery, she found something disturbing. Evidence suggesting Ortega might not have been the mastermind, but a middleman forced into trafficking under threat. There were inconsistencies in the police reports, missing camera footage, and informant statements that didn't add up. She took the files to her supervisor. He told her, "Don't overthink it. Just secure the conviction." So she did. Ortega was sentenced to 40 years. The DA's office celebrated. Rachel smiled for the cameras, but inside she felt sick. Then, a week later, a woman showed up at her office, a stranger who introduced herself as Ortega's cousin. She said the family knew he'd been framed and that Rachel wasn't to blame. Then she handed Rachel a small sealed envelope. Inside was a check, $50,000, and a note, "For what you deserve." Rachel stared at it for hours. She told herself it was blood money. She told herself to turn it in. But the next morning, she deposited it into a newly opened account under her sister's name. It was the first time she crossed the line. It wouldn't be the last. Over the next year, she began quietly accepting offers from defense attorneys who wanted early insight into the DA's strategies, draft indictments, witness schedules, plea offers before they were public. She justified it as harmless. They'd find out eventually, she told herself. This just speeds it up. But word spread fast among the defense bar. Soon, Rachel was being approached directly, cash in envelopes, wire transfers, even Bitcoin deposits, for information about ongoing investigations. Some of her leaks caused mistrials. Others led to suspects vanishing before arrest. Still, she managed to hide her tracks. She was careful, printing documents only once, using burner phones, deleting every trace. And for a while, no one suspected her, until the Santiago case. It was the largest organized crime investigation in the state's history, a 2-year operation involving wiretaps, undercover agents, and sealed warrants. Rachel was part of the inner prosecution team. The night before the first series of raids, she received a message on her burner phone. One last tip, $100,000. She hesitated. The raids would cripple a major drug network, but $100,000 could change her life. It could pay off her debts, fund a fresh start. She told herself it wouldn't make a difference. The system will catch them anyway. She leaked the list. The next morning, every target was gone. The safe houses were empty, the warehouses cleared out, the wiretaps silent. Someone had tipped them off. Within hours, the FBI was involved. The breach was devastating, and suspicion fell immediately on the prosecution team. Internal investigators began combing through phone records, login histories, and print logs. When they found that Rachel's credentials had been used to access sealed warrants hours before the raids, she claimed her account had been hacked. But forensic analysts uncovered a pattern. Her login activity matched the timing of previous leaks. They traced her burner number to a prepaid card purchased at a gas station near her apartment. Then came the bank records, deposits to her sister's account from offshore sources that coincided perfectly with case milestones. When federal agents arrived at her doorstep, she didn't resist. She asked if she could put on her shoes first. During questioning, she tried to stay composed. But as the evidence mounted, she broke down, sobbing that she just wanted to feel in control again. Her confession stunned everyone in the Phoenix DA's office. They couldn't believe the woman who fought so passionately for victims' rights had been selling justice piece by piece. Prosecutors called it one of the worst breaches of trust in Arizona's legal history. At her trial, her defense team painted her as a victim of burnout, a dedicated public servant crushed under debt and despair. The prosecution disagreed. They called her actions treason against the law itself. In 2021, Rachel Meyers was convicted of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and unauthorized disclosure of sealed information. She was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The sentencing judge, himself a former prosecutor, told her, "You weren't corrupted by criminals, you became one of them." In prison, Rachel lived quietly. Other inmates called her the DA, a nickname that carried both respect and irony. She worked in the library, proofreading inmate appeals and advising them on legal filings. In a way, she became what she'd once claimed to be, a defender of the powerless. But it was too late to undo the damage she'd caused. Outside, her name became shorthand in law schools for ethical collapse, a reminder that corruption doesn't always come from greed, but sometimes from exhaustion and disillusionment. Years later, in a rare interview, a reporter asked her if she regretted it. Rachel looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "I spent years sending people to prison for their choices," she said. "I just never thought I'd join them there." The camera lingered on her face as she looked away, still calm, still poised, but now stripped of the illusion that justice was something she ever truly understood. Because for Rachel Meyers, the crime wasn't just betrayal. It was the quiet belief that morality could be borrowed, just like money, and paid back later. But later never came. Daniel Harker's rise in New York's legal world was nothing short of meteoric. He was the youngest partner ever appointed at a prestigious Wall Street law firm, known for his sharp mind, relentless ambition, and ability to turn even the bleakest corporate scandals into triumphs. Colleagues described him as ruthless in logic, flawless in execution. Clients adored him because he got results, no matter the odds. But behind that brilliance lay a growing darkness, an obsession with control so consuming that he eventually lost everything he'd built. It began with a merger deal in 2016. Two pharmaceutical companies, each under quiet federal scrutiny, were negotiating a billion-dollar consolidation. Daniel represented the acquiring firm, and the deal was risky. Regulatory approval could make or break it. Late one night, while reviewing confidential financials, Daniel stumbled across a set of internal memos indicating that one of the firms had knowingly concealed safety data on a major drug. If the information surfaced, the merger would collapse. His client would lose millions. Daniel made a choice. He deleted the files, altered the audit logs, and drafted a replacement report that excluded the incriminating details. The merger went through, and Daniel received a record-breaking bonus. That was the first time he altered evidence. It wouldn't be the last. The success made him bold. Over the next few years, Daniel began quietly manipulating case materials, rewriting witness statements, redacting documents before they reached regulators, and pressuring junior associates to sanitize discovery files. Each act was small enough to seem defensible, easy to rationalize as strategy. But the pattern deepened, and with every deceit his confidence grew. He began calling himself, half-jokingly, the architect of outcomes. But the problem with architecture is that every structure, no matter how perfect, depends on what's buried beneath it. In 2019, Daniel took on a client named Linton Aerodyne, a defense contractor accused of violating export control laws. The government had evidence showing that Linton's executives had sold restricted components to overseas buyers. If convicted, it would destroy the company, and Daniel's reputation with it. So he built a plan that would save them both. He convinced a senior engineer at Linton to produce falsified test data, making it appear as though the components in question were non-restricted prototypes. Then, Daniel personally edited the chain of custody logs to match the altered narrative. On paper, the company looked clean. In court, he stood before the jury and declared with absolute conviction that the government's case is based on fiction. The jury believed him. Linton Aerodyne was acquitted. The victory was celebrated in headlines, legal panels, and corporate boardrooms. Daniel's fame exploded. He was profiled in Forbes as the lawyer who outsmarted Washington. But beneath the applause, one man was quietly piecing together the truth. His name was Eric Nolan, a mid-level IT analyst at the firm who'd been asked to help recover old files during the trial. When Eric compared the archived metadata to the documents used in court, the timestamps didn't align. Some PDFs had been edited after they were officially filed. Eric brought his concerns to compliance. But before they could investigate, Daniel called him into his office. What was said in that meeting was never recorded, but according to later testimony, Daniel threatened him. "If you say a word about this, your career ends tonight." Eric quit 2 days later. 6 months after that, he contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office. What followed was a slow, meticulous unraveling. Federal agents quietly subpoenaed the firm's internal systems. They reconstructed deleted logs, recovered backup drives, and traced a trail of manipulation stretching back nearly 5 years. What they found was staggering. Dozens of altered documents, hidden communications with clients, and emails showing Daniel instructing associates to adjust evidence for strategic clarity. The FBI raided his office one October morning. Daniel was mid-meeting with a major client when agents entered, confiscating his laptop and hard drives. He didn't resist. He didn't even speak. That afternoon, the news broke. Wall Street attorney accused of evidence tampering and obstruction in federal investigations. The shock reverberated through New York's legal circles. For years, Daniel had been a symbol of mastery and control. Now, he was the embodiment of deceit. During his trial, prosecutors presented his actions as a systematic betrayal of justice. They argued that he had turned the law into an instrument of corruption. The defense countered that Daniel had acted under immense pressure, that he'd been protecting clients from overzealous regulators. But the emails told a different story. He wasn't protecting anyone but himself. One exchange between him and a client became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. The client had asked, "Can you guarantee this won't come back to us?" Daniel replied, "It can't come back if it never existed." The jury deliberated less than a day. In 2022, Daniel Harker was found guilty on multiple counts of obstruction of justice, falsifying evidence, and conspiracy to defraud the federal government. He was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. When the verdict was read, he showed no emotion. But as the judge delivered his final remarks, "You sought to master the system, Mr. Harker, and in doing so, you destroyed the very thing that made it possible." Daniel's composure cracked. Witnesses said he closed his eyes and whispered something under his breath. No one could hear what it was. In prison, he withdrew from everyone. Guards described him as quiet, methodical, still wearing the same expression of control that once charmed juries. He spent most days in the library, reading criminal procedure textbooks and marking them with red ink, correcting case citations, rewriting arguments, as if he were still in charge. A journalist who interviewed him later asked, "Do you think the system failed you?" Daniel smiled faintly and said, "No. The system did exactly what I taught it to do, punish weakness. I just didn't realize I'd become the weak one." Outside, his former firm erased every trace of him. His framed portrait was taken down, his name stripped from the company website, his clients reassigned. But in quiet legal circles, his legacy lingered like a ghost story told to young associates late at night. Not about greed, not about arrogance, but about how the smartest man in the room can become his own evidence. Because Daniel Harker didn't just commit crimes, he engineered his own conviction. If you found this story gripping, subscribe for more real cases where power, ambition, and corruption collide. Each week we uncover true stories of lawyers, judges, and officials who crossed the line they once swore to defend. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter.